James Toney, Evander Holyfield, Carlos De Leon, David Haye, Dwight Muhammad Qawi, and Thomas Adamek. Now you might be thinking, why did I just name 6 random fighters with absolutely no context whatsoever? Well, they're not random. All 6 of these fighters are the only cruiserweights in recorded history that were brave enough to make the jump to the heavyweight division. And among these fighters, all of them have at least one title at the cruiserweight class, while nearly half were able to also achieve a single heavyweight championship title. Impressive as this may be, this surely can't be every single fighter in history that transitioned from cruiserweight to the heavyweight division. And yeah, I lied. I did miss out on just one fighter. This fighter has undoubtedly wreaked havoc within the cruiserweight class by asserting his dominance, and this is no other than Oleksandr Usyk. Yet still being undefeated in his career, Usyk has the opportunity to truly cement his legacy in potentially becoming the first undisputed cruiserweight and heavyweight champion of the world within the current era of the 4-belt generation. In comparison to other individual-based sports, boxing stands as extremely captivating, whereby fighters have the flexibility as well as the opportunity to raise their ceiling while unlocking their true potential by facing greater competition. Fighters can either remain within their weight class or boldly make the decision to move up the division, and so boxers are truly never limited to who they might potentially face. After multiple years from its conception, the sport has become much more sophisticated with its changes to its rules, weight classes, fighting regulations, and most importantly, the progression of skill that today's fighters now possess. Think about it, the sport that these fighters knew to be back in the day is certainly not the same sport that these current fighters of today will recognize the sport of boxing to be. I mean, just look at what they're wearing. I'm not even joking. This is literally a grown-ass man wearing diapers. There have only been a small percentage of fighters in history that were fortunate enough to win a championship title, but only a fraction of that small percentage was able to achieve a title within the weight division above, and unfortunately for most fighters, failed miserably in their attempt to rewrite history. Here are 3 cruiserweights that were unsuccessful in their attempt to rule at the heavyweight division. James Toney began his career all the way from the middleweight division and further progressed through the weight classes while achieving several championship titles at middleweight, super middleweight and the cruiserweight division. Despite being a short and stocky fighter, Toney was generally considered to be one of the most gifted fighters of his time due to what he had accomplished. He then went on competing at heavyweight and had somewhat of a decent career, but by far his most notable victory was against the 40-year-old Evander Holyfield in the tail end of his prime, and defeated the former champion by a 9th round corner stoppage in 2003. And then 2 years later, Toney defeated John Ruiz by unanimous decision for the WBA heavyweight championship title. However, his victory was overturned due to failing a drug test just days after the fight, and thus relinquished his heavyweight title. And since then, Toney continued with not much success within the weight class, and even made an appearance in the UFC, but unfortunately lost by submission during his debut back in 2010, and then officially retired with a record of 77 wins, 10 losses and 3 draws. Now, Dwight Muhammad Qawi was somewhat reminiscent to Joe Frazier. Dwight was a brute force at both the light heavyweight and cruiserweight division, where he went on bouts defeating highly skilled opposition. Although Qawi didn't achieve any notable victories at heavyweight, but he did have a moment that landed him a spot within the International Boxing Hall of Fame, and this was where he fought tooth and nail against Holyfield by taking him the entire distance of 15 total rounds, but unfortunately lost by split decision in 1986. Within the following year, Qawi went on to try avenge his loss, but was emphatically stopped by a crushing 4th round knockout victory, and by now you would have thought that he would have learned his lesson. But shockingly, he then challenged George Foreman, who was still visibly in his prime, and up until that point, Foreman had only lost 2 of his 54 professional bouts. Without much surprise, Qawi was then stopped again by a 7th round TKO victory in favour of George Foreman. Now finally coming to his senses, Dwight went back to fighting much smaller men and eventually retired his boxing career with a fighting record of 41 wins, 11 losses and a single draw. Carlos De Leon without doubt was a fine cruiserweight boxer. The Puerto Rican fighter was able to find great success within the division by accomplishing 4 championship titles across 4 separate title reigns, meaning that he lost his championship belts on 3 occasions in which he was able to avenge and finally regain them back. And within history, being recognized as a 4-time champ is an extremely impressive accomplishment, and I believe this truly shows how good a fighter he was during his prime. Carlos achieved his most notable victory over Leon Spinks and crushed Spinks by a 6th round corner stoppage in 1983, and further went on an impressive 7-win streak just shortly before moving up to heavyweight. And in 94, during his debut, Carlos lost by TKO only 50 seconds into his fight against Corey Sanders. And then the following year, De Leon finally retired his boxing career with a fighting record of 52 wins, 8 losses and 1 draw. We now finally come around to the 3 cruiserweights that were successful in their jump to the heavyweight class. Beginning with the Polish-born cruiserweight fighter Tomasz Adamek, had a remarkable start to his career, winning 31 of his first professional fighting bouts. And during his victory run, he was able to achieve championship titles both at light heavyweight and the cruiserweight division. And just a few years later, he made the decision to move up a weight class. And in great fashion, he achieved a knockout victory during his heavyweight debut, and went on to defeat another 5 opponents just shortly before losing to Vitaly Klitschko for the WBC heavyweight championship title. Despite losing his greatest chance to arguably the most dominant heavyweight fighter at the time, Thomas was nowhere near finished, and continued to win 9 of his next 13 scheduled bouts. Although Adamek never achieved a heavyweight championship, I do believe he was able to contend against tough opposition by not retreating back to the cruiserweight class. And in 2018, after losing his final bout against Gerald Miller, he then retired with a fighting record of 53 wins and 6 losses. We now come around to arguably the greatest cruiserweight fighter of all time. Not only did Holyfield dominate the cruiserweight class, he also defeated a great number of extremely tough heavyweight fighters during his championship run. Despite not necessarily being the most physically imposing fighter in his time, Holyfield proved that fighters of a slimmer build were just as capable as much bigger and much stockier fighters. And in 1988, he then achieved 3 cruiserweight titles within a single reign to then become the first undisputed cruiserweight champion of the world. After reaching this level of success, Holyfield made the jump to the heavyweight class and fought prominent fighters with crushing victories against Buster Douglas, who at the time defeated Mike Tyson in one of the most shocking upsets in boxing history. As a result, he became undisputed at the heavyweight division, and at the time this was something entirely unheard of for a natural cruiserweight fighter. Within the next decade, Holyfield went on to defeat George Foreman, Larry Holmes, Riddick Bowe, Mike Tyson twice, and John Ruiz. After that stint, Holyfield was at a visible decline and lost all his major titles against Lennox Lewis in '99. He then went on to fight a few more times and then officially retired in 2014 and finished his career with a boxing record of 44 wins, 10 losses and 2 draws. Now, during the mid-2000s, the British cruiserweight David Haye was easily one of the toughest fighters at the time. After beginning his professional career, Haye went on to win 21 of his next 22 fights, with his one and only loss against Carl Thompson for the IBO cruiserweight title. And 4 years later, Haye was just 1 belt shy from becoming an undisputed cruiserweight champion, just shortly after defeating Enzo Macrinelli. After moving up a weight class, he made his first appearance within the division, achieving a TKO victory. Haye continued with great momentum and defeated notable heavyweights such as Derek Chisora, Audley Harrison and John Ruiz. But by far his most remarkable feat was when he defeated the 7-foot giant Nikolai Valuev for his first and only heavyweight title. Like with many other fighters eventually, David Haye began to show his age and was now past his prime. As a result, during his final career bouts, Haye had lost 3 fights, with 1 loss against Vladimir Klitschko which ended by decision, and then 2 losses by TKO against Tony Bellew in both fights. The Haymaker hung up his gloves after achieving a major heavyweight title and also making a couple of title defenses along the way, and finally retired his fighting career, achieving a record of 28 wins and 4 losses. And in order for me to emphasize what Usyk has achieved so far, I'll show you a graphic of how he exactly compares to his cruiserweight contemporaries. This statistic shows the total number of championship titles as well as displaying their knockout percentages. Now at first glance, you will see that Usyk has a higher knockout percentage than the majority of fighters among this list, with only having a lower percentage than David Haye. Usyk as well as De Leon are the 2 only fighters among this list that possess the greatest number of cruiserweight titles and were able to achieve 4 titles during their career. And in addition to his cruiserweight titles, Usyk has the second most heavyweight titles with only 3 to his resume, while Holyfield boasts more than double of that number by achieving 8 heavyweight titles. These feats are truly insane when you really think about it. With a few days away from the rematch between Anthony Joshua and Oleksandr Usyk in Saudi Arabia, this will be another great opportunity for for Usyk to demonstrate to the entire boxing world who is unquestionably the better skilled fighter, to ultimately put all forms of speculation to rest. And as for Joshua, this rematch might well be the fight of his entire life, where his career and also his confidence might take a turn for the worse if he were to lose this fight. Whereas for Usyk, he'll be one step closer to attain the unattainable. There's only ever been a total of 3 undisputed cruiserweight champions within the history of the sport. Within the 3-belt era, Evander Holyfield was the first undisputed champion after achieving the WBA, WBC and IBF titles, and O'Neal Bell, who fought during the exact same era, also became the second undisputed champion in 2007. And then the most recent addition to this list is Oleksandr Usyk, who was recognized as the 3rd cruiserweight to become undisputed. But in addition to this title, Usyk also stands as the first undisputed champion within the 4-belt era, which includes the WBO championship title. And so you might be thinking, how exactly do these fighters exactly compare? On paper, it is quite difficult to determine who clearly has the best statistics, but when you look slightly closer, you begin to see the minor differences. You'll notice that Oleksandr has a slightly better amateur and world title record, while O'Neal has the highest knockout percentage as well as having the greatest number of first-round knockouts. Meanwhile, Evander stands as the youngest fighter among these 3, who became undisputed in the least amount of days, all while having a slightly better professional record. And if you were to ask me, it's quite tough to say, because these 3 individual fighters are far greater than what the numbers might suggest. It certainly goes to show that the sport isn't exactly black and white as some people might think, and so statistics doesn't entirely paint the full picture, but it does certainly give us an outline of what the real picture might look like, and as a result, we considerably get much closer to actually appreciating the art for what it truly is. Thank you all for tuning into this video. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.